Hi, Jillian. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm glad to join your class.
Yeah, great. Let's just jump right in. Um, you are someone for whom the concept of a cyborg is really important. It's you are yourself a cyborg. It's something you identify as.
Yes.
And um, I guess when my students were reading Haraway this week, one of the central questions was sort of like, what's the point of this? Like, what's the point of this idea? Um,
Yeah.
um, you know, Haraway has a couple of suggestions about it says something to do with sort of um, rejecting the desire to return to nature and to like embrace sort of more technological future possible worlds we might live in.
Right.
She says stuff about sort of taking sort of agency over our own bodies and the sorts of creatures that we are, the
Yeah.
technological parts. So, yeah, that's the first question. Sort of, what does the concept of the cyborg or identifying us as a cyborg like do for you? And is it the same sort of stuff that Haraway is talking about, or is it something totally different, or is it something in addition to what Haraway is talking about?
Um, yeah, I think that one way I would answer the question would be by saying, what does the concept of womanhood do for Donna Haraway?
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, I am a cyborg. Like it's personhood. It's as person as being a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a definite departure from Haraway. I'm empathetic to Haraway. She's writing Cyborg Manifesto in 1984. That's like a really long time ago under different administration, different set of political, social, cultural norms. I'm frustrated with Haraway that she has not amended her manifesto since then. Um, but yeah, when I say I'm a cyborg, it's like I'm a woman. I'm queer. I'm pansexual. I'm middle class. I'm a cyborg. It's just as common as those other categories.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for Haraway, it was like really shiny and new. The concept of the cyborg. I also appreciate the ways that Haraway has been pivotal for a lot of people and in people's thinking about tech, gender. But ultimately, the Cyborg Manifesto is a failure because Haraway predicts that tech will liberate us from gender. Haraway also predicts in that one section that specifically Black, Brown, and Indigenous writing is cyborg writing.
Mm-hmm.
And I would posit that if that's true, someone like Sandra Bland is cyborg writing. Sandra Bland, of course, is the Black woman stopped by police for like routine traffic something. But before that, Sandra Bland is a writer and a videographer and a namer. And what she does is she names police violence. So instead of Haraway's idea that this will be liberation, Sandra Bland is killed by the state. So we have some really stark uh, problems with the Haraway. We have the problem of just the utopic vision that she puts forth in 1984, which quite misses the mark of where we are in 2021. So I go to Haraway, like I'm a contrarian, and so I like provocative things too. So when I read the manifesto, I read it with compassion for a fellow contrarian and someone who's also writing a sensational document. It's unclear to me if Haraway believes everything she's writing in manifesto or if she's just like positing wild ideas, right? And that's fine in the 80s, but in 2021 it doesn't work anymore for me. She also neglects entirely deaf, disabled, neurodivergent women So instead of talking about us in the manifesto, she talks about the monster. The thing is that the monster has been an appellation just means name, different name, for deaf, disabled, and neurodivergent women, like for centuries. So she's talking about us using this antiquated language as if it's new. And that's kind of another complaint that I have about the manifesto. Her manifesto doesn't give me license to be a cyborg any more than like a cishet person's writing gives a queer person license to be queer. It's just that she's the biggest voice because she's been fossilized in philosophy on matters of cyborg nature and ontology.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Just to pick more or less at random one
Yeah, yeah.
one really interesting idea in there. You note that, yeah, it's not entirely clear how much, strictly speaking, Haraway actually believes what she's writing,
Right.
and that's kind of characteristic, I think, of like a certain style of like 80s postmodern theory,
Yeah.
which is which places a great emphasis on sort of playing around with words, really.
Right.
And
Right.
um, and I guess I would have expected that there was a similar element of playfulness, or performativity or something, in cyborg identity for you. But now you're saying there's this, you're, at least what I'm hearing there is like, no, it's not about playfulness or irony. This is something that you're doing in perfect sincerity.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think
yeah.
that I only come first of all, I'm skeptical of all sincerity. So there's that. Um but I only come to this sort of um confidence after 10 years. So the first time I claimed cyborg identity was in 2010 in the New York Times with a piece called Going Cyborg. I thought that would be it. Like, going cyborg. I'm a cyborg. I've printed it in the New York fucking Times. You know what I mean? Like, and so it was playful. It was really just personal essay. But like, my thought was, okay, that's it. Like, it's enough. And then I continued with the New York Times for Dawn of the Triborg. Triborg is a word that I use. It's a portmanteau, which just means two words being brought together. So try, or trying the verb, with Borg, Triborg. So a Triborg is a poser, a Triborg is a fake, a Triborg is a non disabled person who desperately wants the hipness and the coolness of being a cyborg. And I think Haraway, well, I call Haraway a triborg in the essay, along with Elon Musk and Kurzweil, other folks. So that was like 2016. Then after that, I thought, okay, we're done here. Like, now the identity is legit. And so for me at this point in 2021, with the identity still not having legitimacy, that's where the sincerity comes from. I'm very playful and performative, but I'm also a creative writer. I'm not a philosopher. So yeah, so at a certain point I was like, okay, I'm not being believed. I'm not being believed that I'm a cyborg. So why am I not being believed? Well, I'm a Lacanian. I love psychoanalytic theory, in part because it's the only field that requires a group of disabled people. Without us, there would be no field. So I was thinking about, of course, structure, naming, names, what names do for us. And I thought, if I want to be taken seriously as a cyborg, I have to start going as the Cyborg Jillian Weise. So that's my name. And my pronoun is CY. And maybe that will like show that I'm not just like sort of kidding or something. The other difference between like Haraway's notion of a cyborg is just metaphor. And so I'm probably the one poet who is very skeptical of metaphor, especially when that metaphor disenfranchises an entire group of people or distorts our lived experience. So, like right now, I have a huge bruise on my face. That's a common cyborg bruise because the tech that I'm walking on, I walk on a microprocessor knee. Um, it's not working right. So this is this bruise from catching myself on my face,
Mm.
and this is very common cyborg. Uh, but I don't think that it's what we think of typically when we think of Donna Haraway's cyborg or like a glam sci-fi cyborg or a Silicon Valley Elon Musk Kurzweil cyborg. So I'm trying to make space for an absolutely common cyborg who does things like fall on the face because the tech is made by triborgs.
Mm. That's so interesting. I think like one of the things that came up in discussion in class this week was that like um, Haraway contrasts the history, as you noted, the history of how people have talked about monsters, conspicuously omitting like actual disabled non-fictional human beings,
Right.
with sort of utopian science fiction where these creatures that have in some way transcended their humanness are like really beautiful and awesome and cool, um um but it's but there's still the same sort of strand of monstrous cyborg in science fiction. I'm
Right.
thinking of the Borg in Star Trek. Like you don't want to be a
Hmm.
Borg. That's not a utopian creature. That's not something you aspire to be.
Right.
So there, but so I'm free associating here a little bit, but like part of what you're saying is like actually like what you really want is some sort of cyborg, or maybe not what you really want, but what you want people to acknowledge in any case is a cyborg identity that's like neither of those things.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
yeah, it's like fallible and vulnerable in roughly the ways that every human being is. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And I mean, I want even more than that for triborgs to acknowledge that disabled people are the original cyborgs, that we are, um, like, if you're going to talk about cyborgs, you're actually talking about disabled people, all the way back to Hephaestus in the Aeneid, the god of fire who's like a Don Juan, and he's polyamorous and he has all these children from different women, but he's also very much a disabled figure and he's making like fire wheeled fire carts. I mean, I don't even exactly know what it is that he's making, but he's making assistive cyborg devices to help him in his workshop, basically. And that is the original cyborg. So it doesn't start with Haraway, it doesn't start with sci-fi, it doesn't start with the NASA scientists who coined the word. It doesn't belong to non-disabled people. It's actually belongs to disabled people. Um, and that's a harder thesis for non disabled people to really accept. I don't know why. There's a lot of possessiveness over the notion of the cyborg. So there's a lot of pushback that I get from the even idea that it doesn't belong to non-disabled people and there's an entire history of cyborgs and we are disabled.
That's really interesting, and this maybe opens up another question that I had wanted to discuss, which is a, about literalness and metaphor in this
Yeah.
context. So, I think the when I have, at least in the past, thought of literal cyborgs, I've thought of um, creatures with machine parts and biological parts, and um, then you can take that sort of idea metaphorically to describe And so a lot of the literal cyborgs will be either science fiction,
Hmm.
fictional creatures, or will be human beings using some sort of prosthesis, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
um,
But
and
like, let's just slow down right there, because
yeah,
this is a part where things get really interesting, I think.
good.
Human beings using prosthesis is a triborg way of describing cyborgs, because for the longest time I was told, well, you're not a cyborg because that's not your leg, it's a prosthetic. And so I had to figure out how to say back, it is a prosthetic and it is my leg. So there's something coveted about the idea of real and fake among non disabled people. It seems very important that non disabled people know what is real and what is fake.
Mhm.
Maybe it relates to Freud's the uncanny, I don't know. But in cyborg land, it's very natural for me to say my leg and refer to that. That signifies my prosthetic.
Mhm.
And it's not a fake leg to me because I experience it as very real.
Mhm.
So ontologically, there's a slippage that happens right in that moment when we're talking about like people with prosthetics. We are talking about cyborgs.
Mhm.
Um, and the prosthetic has been a way for triborgs to discount cyborg identity.
Mhm.
Well, you're not a cyborg, you have a prosthetic, right? And I think that a lot of the work that I'm trying to do is to push back against that like distinction, or even the idea that we agree on what is real and what is fake. I don't think we agree on that. Um,
Yeah.
so I think a lot about like Zizek and Habermas. I think about their argument about democracy. And one thing that Zizek says is there will be chaos because the options have not been articulated. And I love that moment because what I'm doing is articulating an option that hasn't been articulated. And so what I often encounter is chaos. The chaos of, wait a second, what do you mean cyborgs are already here? Cyborgs are in the future, or are like always imminently in the future, or cyborgs are, you know, I don't know. I don't know what people think cyborgs are,
Mhm.
but there seems to be a bit of chaos when I say I am a cyborg, period. And it's another kind of personhood like any other that a person might experience. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I that's really interesting. I guess one, continuing to free associate, but
Yeah.
I'll indulge myself here. I guess like one connection that I'm making here is to an idea in philosophy that hasn't come up explicitly in class, although it might have. Um, just to what philosophers call the extended mind. So the idea
Mhm.
that our mental states, at least, are what you believe, what you remember, what you know, maybe how you feel in various ways,
Yeah.
is determined not only by the states of by the physiology of what's going on under your skin, but also by um, what's available to you in your environment and what sorts of artifacts you've used to sort of outsource work that your brain might be doing.
Hmm.
Um, and so a classic example would be like a person with some memory loss who uses a notebook to keep track of things,
Hmm.
but is functionally able to, by just reading the notebook, is functionally able to remember the same sorts of things as somebody without this memory loss. And so philosophers who buy this idea of the extended mind, um, uh, some people take it, you can take it in sort of more or less extravagant directions, I guess, ontologically, but some people in any case will say yeah, we're constantly sort of absorbing our environments into
Mhm.
our minds, in the sense that our what we know and do and so on is determined by our environments just as much by our brains. Okay. um I guess, is that, but okay, this is not a characterization of disabled people. This is a characterization of how people utilize their environments in general.
Right.
um and so, um is this
Except
the
for
thing?
the memory loss example, which
Yeah,
that person might be disabled, that person might claim disabled.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe glasses are a sort of example, although that's not very, because in the sense that I can't see more than a couple of inches away from my face
Yeah.
wearing them. But
It's a kind of technology, sure. It's a
yeah.
kind of technology. I mean, I think that I hesitate to gatekeep who's a cyborg and who isn't, but like I don't think that we're all cyborgs, which is Haraway's claim in the manifesto. We are all cyborgs. I first of all don't like universalizing language. Like we are not all whatever. Um, we are not all white. We are not all Christian. We are not all monogamous. We are not, you know what I mean, on and on.
Mhm.
So I don't think we are all cyborgs. There's a different, like some people say, oh, but my phone, if I lost my phone, but if you lost your phone, just taking it literally, it would take you maybe 2 days to purchase a new phone and to be back on your phone. Whereas my leg is taking 7 months and is endangering my life because of the falling, and it's making me sustain like injuries, whereas your phone isn't injuring you.
Mhm.
um so that's one distinction I make, like how like it's just I don't like I understand the idea that like we're part of tech and tech's part of us. I just reject it as a yeah, as I reject it outright and return to my position, which is I only recognize cyborgs who are disabled or trans.
Mhm.
I recognize trans cyborgs for and disabled cyborgs who augment their bodies with pharmaceuticals. I think that's a cyborgian thing to do. And it's also a thing that affirms identity
Mhm.
and requires, yeah, augmentation. So that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at in terms of who is a cyborg that I recognize.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think yeah, something is, so you somehow trivialize the concept, if you just sort of, run all of our relationships with technology
Mhm.
together, or try to find, if you try to find some common ground in the social position of literally everybody on earth, you're only going to end
Yeah.
up with a sort of, yeah, empty or trivializing characterization of them. Although then, so I guess, you know something Haraway might say in her defense is like, well, okay, yeah, there's the literal cyborg, but then in the metaphorical sense, where a cyborg is, I guess, a combination of different parts or aspects that either we had sort of thought about as different, or maybe, uh, where the distinction between those two different types of parts is like a sacred distinction.
Mhm.
Um, uh, in that sense, in this metaphorical sense, yeah, everybody's a cyborg. And then, so then the follow up question, which is the question we started out with, is like, well, what's useful about that metaphor? And clearly, Haraway thinks something's useful, but
Mhm.
uh, maybe my ideas from before explained that clearly enough. But yeah, so I guess if you don't buy that metaphor, or if you want to reject the metaphor, like, yeah, why?
Um, it's not useful to me. It's just not useful to me. And worse than that, it led to like 3 decades of erasure of disabled cyborgs. And I mean, I'm skeptical of any uh like of cults of personality. And so of course in philosophy, like we have a lot of cults of personality. And so I even didn't publish my critique of Haraway until I had tenure. It so that in and of itself makes me skeptical of the manifesto, and also of a lot of like the entire system. Like the fact that we're worried about critiquing certain people is strange. Why else should I reject the metaphor? It's a harmful metaphor. It actively harms disabled cyborgs because instead of those intervening 30 years leading to assistance for disabled cyborgs, the metaphor just universalized cyborg identity and made it seem like everyone's a cyborg. So, how did it harm us? I mean, like the Sandra Bland example. I mean, we've been killed. We've been like triaged out of ventilators. A eugenical strand has continued unabated. I think especially when Haraway in that manifesto offers the one example she goes to in literature beyond people of color is a woman's novel. I haven't read it. It's something about the ship. It's a sci-fi novel. I mean, we saw that come true in the case of Ashley X. We saw that go. So we saw that go from like a sci-fi novel into a feminist philosophical text into practice where non-disabled doctors and bioethicists decided for a 12-year-old girl, along with her parents, that it would be a good idea to remove her breast buds and give her a full hysterectomy because then it would be easier to care for her. And I can't imagine us getting there without Haraway's support and without sci-fi support. Um, so yeah, I'm extremely critical. I mean, I think that um, yeah, I'm thinking of Ishmael Reed's work right now. He's a poet and a novelist and a playwright. And in his book Flight to Canada, one character says, "What good is words?" And the other character says back, "Words build the world." And I think that Haraway's words built the world for a long time. And now we need to look at that world. And I'm not impressed with the world that those words built.
Yeah, yeah. I think I think that's there's going to be some really difficult, sort of tricky history to tell at some point, or maybe we can tell it now, but I'm not in a position to,
Yeah.
um, of exactly how. I mean, obviously, like ableism predated 1985, but like
Yeah.
um, but how exactly this, yeah, sort of running together of a very specific experience of disability with like every other way of being human or something like that. um yeah, what that does to medicine, what that does to people's desire for recognition in the law, in public discourse. Yeah.
When you don't
Maybe.
even have to go, I mean, another clear example of the harmfulness of, well, first of all, the manifesto is a genre. So I have to always think, okay, the genre of the manifesto isn't meant to be taken seriously. It's always flamboyant, sensational. It's not the law. It's not even like, I don't know, this seminar that I'm reading right now, which is seminar 3 of Lacan, the
Uh-huh.
psychosis. It's not even a seminar, right? It's a manifesto.
Uh-huh.
So I want to give it, I mean, I don't want to put too much like it doesn't deserve um it doesn't deserve us taking it seriously because manifestos aren't taken seriously.
Uh-huh.
At the same time, I'm thinking of just Gamergate as an example in which this manifesto clearly got it wrong because the manifesto said we're going to be liberated from gender and tech's going to liberate us. And in fact, being online is going to liberate us. And we have Gamergate which is a disability moment because the woman at the center of Gamergate who got doxxed and threatened and etc. She got doxxed and threatened, I think, in part because she had written a game. I think it's called Depression Quest, but she had written a game about depression. And so this goes like against gaming in whatever year this is, 2013, 2014. This was a narrative game. It was a game that had affective feelings that you don't expect from video games about depression and etc. And so if Haraway's manifesto was a roadmap to the future, then it's just fiction. It didn't lead that way. It didn't go that way because instead we have women gamers designing a game around disability whose lives are being threatened. And so how liberating is that? That's not liberating. Um, so yeah, I think I'm still waiting for Haraway to make an amendment of some kind or a vision. But she went to animals, which I think is quite funny because animals can't talk back. And so she's quite safe. She's quite safe doing animal studies. Whereas cyborgs, I don't know that she anticipated cyborgs actually existing and coming for her manifesto to correct it, reject it, contest it. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's the Gamergate connection is really interesting. At one point in the manifesto, she talks about um, uh, the pleasure that comes from sort of skill and
Right.
skillful being in the world, and that's uh, and I think it's there is pleasure that comes from doing things skillfully.
Yeah.
But also, like Gamergate was, among other things, a sort of competition between this, like, yeah, like super macho uh, video game culture, which was entirely about games of skill,
Mm-hmm.
pitted against like, yeah, new types of designers, video game designers, often women, who were just trying to make games that weren't based on sort of skill and mastery. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And in a lot of ways, I wish that Haraway's manifesto were the accurate roadmap because there would have been no threat to life if Haraway had been correct. It would have been like, look, and now we have exponential amounts of women gamers and marginalized gamers, and we don't. We
Mhm.
still don't. So it's very much a utopic manifesto.
Yeah, I think the maybe I don't want to talk about it too much because my students haven't read it, but your poem, I think is it called Biohacker's Manifesto?
Yeah,
Is
biohack manifesto. Yep.
that might be an interesting sort of contrast as another manifesto that uses centrally a, a sort of technological idea or a way of thinking about our
Right.
relationship to ourselves technologically, but uh, yeah, you couldn't accuse it of not centering disabled people. It's entirely about disability, or at least
Yeah.
um, maybe so interested viewers could go check that out. It's a good poem. Maybe this is a good place to get to another question. I don't know. I don't know if there's a non-awkward segue, so I'm just going to make the awkward segue. Um, you know, one of the week before we were talking about the Cyborg Manifesto, we were talking about the relationship between disability and well-being,
Yeah.
and uh, uh, an old paper from the philosopher Elizabeth Barnes, somebody who's written more recently about this, uh, arguing that disability might harm people in some sort of very specific local ways, but that overall disability sort of a wash. You know, it's sort of total effect on your quality of life or well-being can go either way. And I guess, you know, on the one hand, on the and so I don't have very strong opinions about this. I'm not a disabled person,
Mhm.
so um, but I find myself, and I think a lot of the students found themselves in reading it, sort of pulled in a couple of directions. Sort of like, on the one hand, you see the types of sort of special sources of value that people get from disability. They can get, you know, the deaf community is like a really rich
Yeah.
example of this. Like, you get community, you get sort of forms of relating with one another, but also, like, if you're an activist or an artist or somebody who's sort of who works within disability, you
Mhm.
know, you might think, well, hey, I'm leading this like really rich, interesting life, which is opened up for me by my disability. And
Right.
so um, that's the on the one hand, and then on the
Mhm.
other hand, there are any number of ways in which disability can be different. Disabilities are different, but, you know, different disability can be harmful to a person. So there's the social stuff, the stigma and the discrimination and the failures
Mhm.
of accommodation, but there's also chronic pain or just actual physical or mental limitations that prevent you from doing things you might have otherwise wanted to do.
Mhm.
And, you know, I in in thinking about this, you know, trying to keep those two sets of considerations front of mind for me is just really hard. Um,
Yeah.
and so I wonder, what, like, how how, if at all, have you done that? I mean, how do you have any sort of way of thinking about the relationship between disability and well-being in your own life or in general, or sort of reconciling these two sorts of uh, competing considerations that I spoke about a minute ago?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm very much with disability justice, which there are 10 principles by Patty Byrne online if anyone wants to follow up on what is disability justice. But so I've gone from thinking about disability in a medical model way. I was born disabled. So I was raised in a medical model way, which is a diagnostic way. Here's the diagnosis, it's bad, we need to fix it. To a social model way, the social model saying, you're not disabled, the environment disables you. I have a lot of problems with the social model because I don't want anyone telling me I'm not disabled. Like, yes, the environment disables me, and yes, I am disabled at the same time. To a social justice model, which is an identity based model, to disability justice. So this is all evolving within disability community. Um, I'm bringing up Ishmael Reed because I just interviewed him for Poetry Magazine, and I mean, I'm all about disability pride, cyborg pride. Pride is important to me, but in conversation with Ishmael Reed, he just wrote a very long poem called "The Jazz Martyrs," where he talks about why did so many of the jazz musicians die before the age of 40, and why were they often punished by the police, which led to disabling conditions. And so then I have to really rethink my, and I don't know the answer, but I have to really rethink my like emphasis on pride. Like, how am I asking everyone who's disabled to be full of pride if the disability came from police violence or if the disability came from some event that's traumatic? Um, so I think there's a difference in community between those of us who were born disabled and those of us who have a before and an after, an event, an accident, something happened. Because I don't have in my conscious mind a before. So like I don't have any like sense of the before.
Mhm.
Um so yeah, I think it's tricky. I think though that the reason why I lean so much on pride is because the world wants me to not be proud.
Mhm.
And there's a poet, Laura Hershey, who has a poem called You Get Proud by Practicing. And the prevailing assumption is that if you're disabled, it's really tragic and sad and it's really bad and hope you get better soon. Okay. So, as long as that's the prevailing assumption, then my response will be to reject that and to embrace pride as an alternate way of being.
Mhm.
Once that's no longer the prevailing assumption, which quite frankly, I don't think we'll see in my lifetime, then I'm excited for disabled people to express their whatever they want to express.
Mhm.
Um, as far as pain goes, I have chronic pain, but I also have great drugs, thanks to pharmaceuticals. And I have privilege of being white and believed when I go to the doctor. So when I say I'm in, well, and having metal in my body. So when I say I have chronic pain, there's proof. They can see it in the x rays. They know where it's coming from. They know that it must be painful. And so for me, the chronic pain, it's like I don't mind it because I'm medicated. But for a disabled person who has chronic pain with no access to medicine or who is not believed by his, her, their doctors, I'm sure that's an entirely different experience of disability. So it is complex. It's definitely complex. Um, I have to always check what is internalized ableism for me too.
Mhm.
When I'm having moments where I'm frustrated with being disabled, I have to check where is this frustration coming from? Is it coming from like the imaginary, the symbolic? Like, is it coming from an external source of shame or construct? Or is it actually coming from me? And I mean, that's often difficult to um, suss out.
Yeah, there's, I think, a couple of ideas that are really helpful there. One, one is that um, when we the way that bioethicists often frame these questions, but also, frankly, the ways that I frame the question to myself, even though I don't think of myself as a bioethicist, have been in terms of well-being. But maybe sort of what we're interested in or what matters more, at least for certain purposes, is not so much the a question of a relationship between disability and well-being, but the question of um, sort of what sort of affective or emotional stance you should have towards disability, either your own disability for the case of the disabled person, or the sort of you know pub the affect that people have, that non-disabled people have towards the disabled. And that, yeah, so yeah, whether we should be
Absolutely. Yeah.
proud of something has nothing to do at some level with its connection to well-being. There is
Hmm.
also, in I'm only realizing this now, but this happened in class too, that we would talk about, I would ask a question about well-being, and then people would very quickly slide into discussions of sort of dominance hierarchies, where it's like,
Oh,
where
yeah.
it's like yeah, no, I like Barnes's argument because disabled people aren't less than, and they should have just as the same sort of say in society, and so on and so forth. And it was like, oh, well, that's not what she's talking about. But it's interesting that you're making
Yeah.
that connection so quickly. So it's interesting to see. I think maybe it's probably important to distinguish these three sorts of questions: the question of affect, the question of hierarchy, and then the question of well-being.
Mhm.
Um, because the practical upshot that you might think sort of goes with one might actually go with the other. I mean, maybe I'll end just one more question, because you've been really generous with
Yeah.
your time. Um, you know, you said at the end that there's there's this sort of constant concern that, whatever your own judgments about uh, your life or disability in general or whatever are going to be shaped by some kind of internalized ableism, and
Mhm.
that it's always just it's a perpetual, or by your social position in ways that are sort of don't reflect reality in general.
Right.
And that it's a constant struggle to get over that. I think one of the things when I watched the documentary Crip Camp, which some of my
Mhm.
students will have seen, when I watched it over, was it over winter break? I can't remember when I watched it. Anyway, when I watched it, it was like what the scenes that some of the scenes that were most interesting to me were these consciousness raising sessions with these like
Mhm.
teenagers just sort of like discussing their experiences frankly with each other in a way that they had never done before. And
Yeah.
this was doing this epistemological work, this knowledge creating work, which was just like really, really powerful. Like they're able to discover stuff that seemingly
Yeah.
nobody around them knew. And
Right.
I wonder. So, although and then at the same time, we also often think of consciousness raising groups as this very 70s thing
Yeah.
that's sort of located in a very specific time and place, and then
Mhm.
okay, that's a thing of the past. So, have you encountered any kinds of epistemic sort of tools, either in relationships with other people, like consciousness raising groups, or just for yourself in your own sort of private thoughts, that help you sort of get out from under the sort of internalized ableism, or think more clearly about these things when sort of prejudice or stereotypes or misleading conventional wisdom might be weighing you down somehow?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, disabled people are not a monolith, of course. So we are in disagreement all the time, although we're in a really strange moment where to disagree publicly with each other is not as acceptable as private disagreements. I
Mhm.
think because we're in a plague, there's a sense that we need to stick together to stay alive. But for me, probably most formative was falling in love with a cyborg, another cyborg, and finding language together. I'm a lifestyle dominatrix. I'm also a relationship anarchist. So I have a partner of 11 years, and then this relationship that I'm speaking of lasted for 3 years. Um, yeah, and so that was really helpful for me to fall in love with this disabled cyborg and to go through just naming, a lot of naming things, like having someone present that's saying, "Oh, actually, we need a name for that. We don't have a name for that." Over and over it was, "We need language. We don't have language. We don't have the words to describe this experience because no one at all has taken disabled cyborg experience seriously. So we should take it seriously. So we should start naming like these things that we're experiencing." So that was huge. That was a huge moment for me to really think about internalized ableism, and also to think about cyborg joy and pleasure. I think I realized in that relationship that the non disabled world wants me to think about access, discrimination, ableism. And while I am conforming to what the non disabled world wants me to think of, I'm missing an opportunity to think about whatever the fuck I want to think about,
Mhm.
right? So that has been my latest joy is just thinking like, wait, is this something that non-disabled people want me to focus on? Or is this something I genuinely want to focus on or something else? And how to flip that for my own mind. Yeah, it's like Borges, disabled writer from Argentina, Borges, saying to his grandson, "If you're good, I'll permit you to think of a bear." And I often feel that way, like as a disabled subject in a non-disabled world, as if I'm being told, like, if you're a good subject, then we'll let you talk to us about access. You know what I mean? And it's like, I don't want to be a good subject. First of all, I don't want the morality of the good minority. And I also don't want to think about access. So, like, that's part of it too. Finding rejection, finding ways to take my attention away from what non-disabled triborgs would have me think of and focus my attention elsewhere.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, that's yeah. Being a rebel and falling in love are two very good pieces of advice for somebody who wants to understand their position in the world.
Yeah,
God,
yeah,
um, well, this is fabulous. I really appreciate you taking the time. I guess we can call it
absolutely.
here. Yeah, great. Well, thank
Cool.
you so much.
Good to meet you, Ian,
Yep.
and thanks for watching class. And what are they doing? Are they doing like a final paper, or what are they doing?
They've got a couple of papers coming up. We've
Okay.
got, let's see, we've got to round off this unit, which is so far mostly focused on disability. We're talking about um, uh, the like cultural engineering in Walden 2 in the Skinner's like utopian
Yeah.
novel, and in and a kind of pushback obliquely from the philosopher Peter Strawson, who
Okay. Cool. Very
so
cool.
and then some Afrofuturist stuff and some stuff about authenticity and then they'll go enjoy their summers.
Fun.
Yeah,
Fun. It sounds like a great class. I'm glad I could visit.
yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye.